Yes, people. Wagwan. Another Wednesday. Man, them chatting at the building. All right, this evening we got a special guest speaker, someone local to us, well, known to us. We got Brother Desmond Clarke in the house, MDC member and historian. Today he's going to be talking about his book, what's just been published recently. It's called Stolen Inheritance. And Des is going to be talking about some of his life journeys and what it takes to be an author and some of his experiences in the British Army. Welcome, Des. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Mark, and greetings to everyone, the man in chat, and welcome to those who are listening and tuning in.
Greetings, family. And
honor the spirit of the ancestor. If to the end so that I can sort of do the presentation and I'll take questions at the end. Yeah, well, my name is Desmond Clarke, and I was born in a little village 7 miles west of the market town of Brownstown in St. Anne, Jamaica in 1953, and spent my first 14 years in my little village, isolated from the world. And at the age of 14 and a half or thereabout, my mother, who had separated from her father, got married to a guy from the village who came to England, and she joined him. And in 1965 and in 1967, I joined my mom and stepfather. And to say that it was a culture shock would be a bit of an understatement, because I came from a village of less than 400 people into a market town of some 80,000. And prior to coming to England, we were socialized or given some kind of colonial education about how great English people in England were. But when I came, it was a bit of a shock to see this of a dirt and this smog. I mean, there was the London brickwork that cover from the motorway to Bedford, the town where I first came. And it had one of the worst record in Britain for infant mortality in the 60s. So to say it was a bit of a drab place, and I was ill-dressed and ill-prepared for this shock. And as I was still of school age, I attended for about a year a local comprehensive school where I was put in a class with people from the new Commonwealth, a euphemism for Black kids. And it basically those from Pakistan, India, the Caribbean, and they were also Italian. So it was basically about learning English. So although I knew English, because I spoke with a Jamaican accent, whenever I tried to say anything, the people would say, "Pardon me." And that was a bit strange to me because I didn't understand what they meant by pardon. I left school after about a year and never sitting, not even a basic exam. It was basically just before I was about 16. I was told, well, you're not coming back in September. So I went and got my first job. I think it was in Woolworths, stacking shelf. And then from one dead-end job to another, because you could go to the Youth Employment Center in those days, and you'd just pick up a card and you could say, yeah, I'll go for this one. But often the receptionist or the person that you were dealing with would run these people that send in the advertisement. And they will say things like, "Oh, I've got a colored boy here." And you'd hear the person say, "No, no, we don't want no colored." So you wouldn't get certain jobs anyway. But just before my 18th birthday, I was well dissatisfied with my youthful days. And I decided, as my granddad was in the army and my cousin in Jamaica was in the JDF, and I've always admired them. So I decided I'd join the British Army to get away from this sort of humdrum lifestyle that I was now caught up in. But to think if it was bad on civilian street, the racism in the army was 24/7. And you didn't have any mates or anything to back you up. So as someone says, Africans have no friends. I felt that way because it's like you're on your own. So it was kill or be killed in a way, literally in a way. So I decided that I would not be beaten by anyone, and I'd rather die than be beaten. So I got into quite a few fights, and I never lost one. And it got to the point where people left me alone. But I felt very isolated because it's like they used to say, I have a chip on my shoulder. And I said, well, you put it there. Now, after about over 3 years in the army, I decided I had enough of it. So I returned to civilian life. But now I had a different attitude towards, well, the old British society, really, because I felt that I wanted to do something, but doing what? And especially when you are amongst people that felt intimidated by the whole environment, because my peers were usually very docile. And I think those who were born in England in the 60s grew up in the 70s to be very docile as far as I'm concerned. But coming from Jamaica, I had that sort of fire in the stomach. So I didn't see things the way most people saw them. Now, when I left the army, I did a few jobs here and there, lorry driving, and got into a family setup. But in '92, to cut a long story short, I had a family breakdown and I lost my mother, who was my uncle. And it left me a little bit confused and bewildered and alone and whatever. So I decided that I would try and get some basic education, because what I was realizing, without an education, it was very difficult to exploit any opportunities that came your way, because they were always looking or putting up barriers, particularly in relation to English and maths and so forth. So most of the better paid jobs needed or required some types of qualification. So after doing a couple of GCSEs and A-levels in the early 90s, I decided I would try my hand at a degree. And after completing my degree in 97, I felt motivated that I wanted to go on, because now I'm beginning to realize there was a lot more I didn't know. So I found a job with the Bedford Chamber of Commerce. But because I wouldn't toe the line, I was soon out of that one. And I did some part-time work as a youth worker, and sometimes I would do some agency driving, but I was still at the loose end to a large extent. So I decided I would sign up for a part-time master's course in education. And I signed up with the Montfort University, and that cost me about $4,000. And I completed that in 2004. And then I was contemplating whether to do a PhD, because I had the bug, as it were. I couldn't stop reading, and I didn't want to anyway. And the more I was finding out, is the more that I needed to find out. So it got to a point where I decided that I was now in a new relationship, and I thought, well, I'll try and do some kind of work and think about things for a while. So I worked with the probation service for a little while, and with the Bedford Youth Service and so forth. And after a while, I decided that I've always wanted to write a book. So it was a bit of a balancing act between doing a PhD or writing my first book. And as by now I had a 9-year-old son, 10-year-old, I thought, let me write something down, because in case I should sort of pass over to the ancestor, I would leave him some kind of legacy. Because as an older dad, I felt that I needed to put something down so he could see who I was to a certain extent. And so I started writing the book, and I decided that I would send a copy to an English publishing firm, and I copied it to myself. I emailed it. I think it was Pegasus. And I emailed a copy to a publisher in America. And the one in England said, sorry. But the one in America said they would love to publish it, and they would like the first refusal on my second one. And because of their sort of reaction to my submission, I hadn't thought previous of doing a second book, but I was so encouraged that I decided I would write another one. And this time, expecting it to be out in the next couple of months. So keep an eye out. It's called Man, God, Religion, and State. So the first one, as I say, was called Stolen Inheritance. And it was published in 2019. And unfortunately, just as it was published, the next following year, the pandemic kicked into action. And so it was a bit challenging to do the promotion and so forth. But it's getting out there, and it's doing okay. Now, I believe in terms of my book, it charts the journey of the African diaspora. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see, it's got an arrow going to the east, an arrow to the west, and an arrow to the north. And that is mainly the direction in which we were taken. And in terms of finding out my own story, I was disappointed and dissatisfied with many of the Eurocentric views of Africa and Africans, and particularly those of the diaspora, because whenever they make reference to Africans in the diaspora, it's always about slavery and slaves. Now, no slave ever left Africa, but people were enslaved and trafficked, and they were forced to work on labor farm in the Caribbean. But prior to that, the African people were the original creator of the first civilization ever known to humankind. And in terms of civilization, they invented writing, which was one of their great inventions. I believe that was to enable them, or it enabled them to transmit information from one generation to the next. It also enabled others to build on what they had preserved. they were also the first people in the world to actually develop systems of mathematics, geometry, astrology. They worked out the number of days in a year before any other people on this planet. And most of the world's religion can be traced back to Africa, whether it's monotheism or polytheism, because they were all practiced first in Africa. Now, in 525, the African kingdom came to an end when the Persian attacked Kemet and forced the Kushite pharaoh, Piniki, to retreat. And Pasternak was put on the throne of Kemet. Now the Greeks, they then overthrew the Persian. And he invaded Kemet in 332 BCE. And after some 300 years, the Greeks were overthrown by the Roman in 38 BCE. They then copied what the Greek had stolen initially and translated many of the Greek texts into Latin. And so they came by knowledge, because the Romans, they couldn't even build a ship. They had to capture a Greek ship to copy it. And the Greek got their learning from Kemet. And when they invaded, they sacked the library at Alexandria, which had most of the world's book at the time. And people like Plato, a student of Socrates, stole many of those books and then opened a school. So when we hear of the Greeks, philosophers and so forth, as our great ancestor, George Moore, James said, they had no philosophers because they were all plagiarists, because it's difficult to see how they could have had any philosophers when they had no school. The only thing they had that came close to a school was what they called the gymnasium. And the gymnasium was used for training warriors. And the Greek city-state existed merely to fight. So when the Roman came along and overthrew them, the Romans started their existence around 700 as an entity in the Po Valley. And Rome was surrounded by the 7 hills. And because of the fertile Po Valley, the Roman tribe was able to conquer surrounding tribes to the point where they were able to spread. And in the 3rd century BCE, they had a number of conflict with the Phoenician and the Punic Wars against what is present-day Tunisia. And if you go to Tunisia to this day, you will see where the Roman committed so much atrocity, and many evidence is still there as to the might of the North Africans. Unfortunately, when Hannibal invaded Rome, he refused to finish them off. And so they were able to recover to then defeat the Greeks. Otherwise, we'll be talking about a different world history today. Now, when the Romans translated many of the Greek texts, they were able to, with the Hebrews, who had given them the knowledge in the first place, were able to translate many of these texts into Latin. And from the Latin, they were able to translate the religious books such as the Septuagint into the Vulgate. And from the Vulgate, you have present-day Bible. But there are many versions of it. That's why you have one called the King James Version. You also have one called the Lutheran version. And so what I would say, there is only one truth. So anything that is a version cannot be the truth, because there's no version to the truth. And the Europeans, they copied what the Latin had given them, because English and Spanish and French is basically a Latin text. Now, in terms of the involvement of the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, or the so-called Arabs, but they were mainly what you'd call mixed Asians and Africans, because they were first called Punic. And they were also called Phoenician and Palestinian and Phoenicians. And many of these people were of mixed African and Asian origin. Because the idea, you have to understand, the idea of Europe is a racial construction, because there's no continent called Europe. There is a continent called Eurasia. And many of the Western Eurasians see themselves as separate from the rest of Eurasia. And so they try to divide the world in a way that it became racialized. Now, the Hebrew brought out the religion of the one God from Kemet. And that one God philosophy has caused many destruction, because it takes on an imperialistic mentality and attitude. And so when the Hebrew met the Greeks, they got influenced by the Greek way of seeing the world, which was patriarchal. So monotheism fitted nicely into patriarchy, because women was no longer playing a role in the public sphere, because Greece and Rome never had a queen, wherein queens and kings were commonplace in Africa. Because there's a story that when Alexander tried to invade Kush, he was met with Queen Candace, who was mounted on an elephant, and he refused to engage her in battle because he was afraid of being beaten by a woman. So the Greeks were basically sort of states, because when Herodotus entered Kemet, he made the reference that the Ethiopians were not like the Greeks, because Plato tried to prove that you could sleep with a boy without actually molesting him. And from that, you get the word platonic love. So the Romans, they were highly, so a religion that glorified the man was welcomed by Greeks and Romans. So it found a place with them. And from that, the African religious system was destroyed, particularly in the 6th century CE, when Justinian outlawed the practice of the African tradition. And it is said that the church that burned down in France, I can't remember the name of it now, but it is supposed to, they've raised $1 billion to rebuild it, was built on the temple of Isis, because Europeans were worshiping African gods and for many centuries, until it was outlawed. And some were treated as witch by the church. And Christianity, coming from the Hebrew, was originally practiced by Greeks. And as Greeks in nature, many of them were, you could say some of the early Christians were. So was the Romans, because many of the later Christians, they did not marry. And the Catholic Church reinforced what is called celibacy. So that's a bit of a questionable practice. Now, Islam came about in the 7th century by its founder, Muhammad. And his right-hand man was an African by the name of Ben Halal. And he was the one that instructed Muhammad about the rituals and practice of Islam, such as the call to prayer. And when he died, actually he should have taken over from Muhammad, but there was this anti-feeling against Africans because many of them had started out as enslaved people. And the Arabs, so-called Arabs, but at the time what you'd say the Asians, were trafficking Africans, particularly from the East African Horn, and turning many of them into male sex slaves, if you want to call them that, because many of them were castrated and emasculated. And the women were seen as prized above all others, because in the Muslim heaven, you'll be given 70 black-eyed virgins, which means African women. So they were highly valued, and many of the so-called Khalifi leaders were mixed Asians and Africans. And later on, many of the so-called Moors were mixed Africans and Asian. And some of them were even European, because the Africans, who they call the Moors, that ruled the peninsula of the Iberian Peninsula, had a liking for European female. And this is why you find there are so many light-skinned people in Morocco, even though it was established by Africans. And the town of Fez was established by an African, and so was Marrakesh. And Gibraltar was named originally after an African general. So many of the early Muslims were Africans, and Africans converted to Islam. And we must remember that the early Christians were basically stationed in Alexandria, Antioch, and later on Rome. But Africa somehow always seems to get bypassed. So these were some of the reasons why I had to research the history of the African people and how I came to be where I was. And in learning about the journey of the African who were enslaved and trafficked to the West, it is most interesting to find that there were many Africans who colluded and benefited from the enslavement and trafficking of his brothers and sisters. And but for that collusion, maybe what happened would have been otherwise. Now, in terms of my book, I've charted these narrative as best as I could, and I've put timelines and so forth. And what I find is that as a student of history, it is sometimes very difficult to face the reality of what one has discovered, because many of the things that I discovered in my research were quite shocking. Because I often hear people, for example, talk about King Musa or Mansa Musa. Mm-hmm. Now, Mansa Musa He went to Mecca on a pilgrimage, and he took 6,000 of his enslaved subjects, and he gave away so much gold that it caused it bankrupt many countries and caused inflation. Now, this is still going on today, that instead of spending the money with the people in Africa or in the diaspora, African leaders are still spending their money with those who continue to oppress us. I mean, when I came to England, for example, in the 60s, and I witnessed some of the abuse that was being meted out on particularly Caribbean people. And all these islands in the Caribbean, which was by now supposedly independent, none of their leaders would raise any objections. Now, you'd have thought that if your citizen were being abused in foreign lands, you'd want to make representation. But there was this lack of support for those who came to this country in the 60s and 70s from their own country from which they came. And I found that quite difficult to deal with. And this is where, when you look into the history of what happened to the African people, we have to be honest and recognize that, but for our own betrayal by our own people, many of the things that befell us would have been otherwise. And that is what I find quite difficult. And it has created a certain amount of distrust amongst us, because sometimes skin folks are not kin folks.
True.
And we have to recognize that racism has never been a legitimate way of treating people. You cannot divide people by race, because race has no meaning. It's just like saying maybe you're better off dividing people by class. I mean, it used to be by language, and then it was religion, then it was race, then it was class. But you see, those who control us will always seek to divide us. And division only serves those who are in power. So when we talk of unity, no civilization has ever existed and developed without a belief system. We need a belief system that is based on the liberation of the human spirit. Because without some belief system that will bind us together, that is why religion is so useful and has proven to be so useful as a way of organizing people, because it binds people together who would otherwise have nothing in common. And because our religious practices have been suppressed and destroyed. I mean, for example, in Jamaica, one of the West African religion of Obeah is illegal, because it was made illegal under the colonial government, because they were afraid that Africans would unite in a way that they couldn't understand. Now, some people are committed to their Christian ways, some are committed to their Muslim ways, but we have to ask ourselves, it may have come from us, but it's no longer ours, because it has been corrupted so much that we cannot recognize ourselves in the religion that we're practicing, because Christianity is anti-African, Islam is anti-Africans. So I cannot see how Africans can be practicing a religion that is against them, that is destined to destroy your confidence and your self-esteem. Now, if you look at the two successful revolutions in the diaspora history, you would find that in Haiti, voodoo was used, which is a West African religious practice. And in Jamaica, The Maroons were successful partly until they colluded with the English and they made some kind of dirty deal. But they were able to resist and protect their own individual limited freedom by their belief in Hobia. So maybe if you look at maybe the Japanese, they believe in their ancestral worshiping, and they've been able to resist colonial oppression. So you cannot practice the oppressor's religion and expect to be liberated. We have to find a way of constructing an identity around a belief system that will enable us to bind ourselves to each other. And I do believe it is possible, because the African people are the first people, and we will be the last people, because we are, as the Greek would say, Alpha and Omega.
Sure.
Now, I hope you'll find my book interesting, because when I wrote it, I was faced with a number of challenges. And to those people out there who feel that they can't do this or they can't do that, if you have the interest in telling your story or to contribute your story to humanity, then go for it. And don't be afraid if you're in doubt of your ability or whether you speak English good enough or what. That's immaterial. What is important is that we must express our voice. We must share our opinion so that the next generation will not be so easily fooled. Because we must face it, our ancestors were lied to. They then lied to us. Now that we know, we cannot keep lying to our children. So we have to declare the truth, that we have the right to be, and we should defend that right to be. And we need more people to be telling their story, because when I started my journey, I was full with self-doubt. And these doubts nearly prevented me from accomplishing my task. So I believe that we need a certain amount of courage, because all writers, I think, need to be courageous, because it's an internal struggle, and it's sometimes the hardest struggle is the struggle against yourself. I hope my book, Stolen Inheritance, that you'll all get a copy of it and share it with your brethren if you can't afford a copy, because I'm more interested in the message. And you can find it on Amazon, and it's published by Austin Macaulay. And you can also get it from Blackwell UK, Brook Bookstore, WH Smith, and from many other book outlets. So I hope my vision for the future is for Africans, whether home or abroad, will see themselves as a people that has contributed so much to so many and has received so little from so many. And yet we continue to lead the way in what you would call human rights struggle, equality struggle, because we are the human being of this planet, and we will be forever. Thank you for listening. And if there are any questions now, I'll take them.
All right. Firstly, thank you so much for your speech, Desmond. It sounds like you had an intertwined youth. You know, the history is intertwined with quite a few things. I wanted to ask you, what was the process, the publishing process that you went through? And how long did you research for your book?
Right, I touched on that.
And you did touch on it, but I mean, like technical, like you you got paperwork, wrote the book, you know what I mean? For those who are looking to publish a book.
Right, because my book is non-fiction, In other words, it's based on evidence, reference, and so forth. I had to be careful of plagiarizing because that can get you into serious trouble.
Right.
So if I use certain information from certain books, I had to reference them. And this is why I, in terms of my academic study, I learned about these things about referencing and the different style of referencing. And when I wrote, I made sure that I had the reference for anything that I use. And in my bibliography, I give full details of all the books and authors, because you have to give reference for the works of others, because nothing is really new. It's just that in the past, people have used other people's work without acknowledging it. The Greeks were masters of that, claiming things that they did not invent, and so forth. So that was part of it. And in terms of the structuring, it's basically like telling a story or cooking a soup. It's knowing when to put certain ingredient in. So I had this image of a soup, and certain things would go in first, and then I'd put other things in. And hopefully by the time I put the last bit in, the soup could come to a ready.
So did you use an outline or a template, or you just went ahead?
Well, I tend to be a little creative. I'm a sort of a thinker, gurgitator. I play things out in my mind. And I had an image of how I wanted it to be. So for example, in my introduction, I put myself out there on the line to say, this is who I am. And then I said, well, why do I want to go into this? Because in a way, I was looking for myself. Because sometimes I used to think, as they say in Jamaica, you must have dropped from sky. Because Black people were invisible in terms of the environment, the hostile environment within which I sort of grew up. Anything Black was usually bad. And when I was studying for my degree, and particularly when I did A-level history, there was a lot of questions that I wanted to ask. But I couldn't ask the people that was teaching me because they had no interest. I remember once I asked, when I was doing my master's, I asked a white male lecturer something relating to the frequency of Black male imprisonment. And I remember he said to me, I don't know, I'm a white man. So what that did, it told me that if I wanted to know, I will have to find out for myself. And that is sadly the way it is. So we need more people to be telling their story so that the next generation that comes along will be able to reference different views about the same things.
Okay.
Because so far there's only been the Eurocentric perspective, and that's all we had to go by. But when you're Black and you recognize that this is not about you, so the history of Africa from a Eurocentric point of view is about the history of European in Africa.
True.
That does not tell me anything about Africans. Yeah.
Okay. Seafood Blaps, you got a question? Got your hand up?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Desmond, sounds like a great book. Sounds like an interesting read. I'll have to find out that one. Have to find that one. I've got a few questions. I was taking notes.
Yeah.
The first one was the amount of people that are going to read this book. because as it's historical, who do you consider are your peers? And if there are any other peers that have reviewed the book, what have they said so far?
Well, I would say that I've come across writers, African historians that I admire, and I've singled out a few of them in the book for praise. And I just turn a page and say, I don't think I think of people like Chika Antidiop, George Granville, Mona James, the Trinidadian Prime Minister, former Minister, Eric Williams, and Chancellor James Williams. Now, to me, these men were, well, for me, they were great because they opened up my eyes to things that I've always thought but didn't understood. And they explained things to me in their works, which enabled me to feel more confident in what I was thinking. So peers, I'm not so sure about peers because I tend to look for teachers, because when the student, I believe when the student is ready, the teacher appear. So I tend to look more towards teachers, as particularly I'm a late developer. So there's a brother that comes on Galaxy Radio, is referred to as Professor Cecil Gosmore. Now, I've met him. He used to be a teacher in the West Indies, a lecturer at University of West Indies. I admire that man greatly because he's well read and he's well articulate. And as a living peer, he's about my age, then I am in awe of him. And I've told him that many times.
Okay, so I was thinking more along the line of Walter Williams, Jabari Assose, those kind of modern scholars that have visited Kemet, visited on many occasions of, especially Walter Williams, Professor Walter Williams. But in regards to the information that you bring, some of it sounds counter to what they say. How are you going to deal with that? Or are you going to debate that?
Well, it's not an issue really, because you say there are different narratives. I usually, as I said to my son, there's three ways you can see history. You can see it from a top-down point of view about the greats, the kings and the queens, or you can see it from the bottom up about how people struggle to make ends meet and how they live their lives. You can see it in another way where there's a mixture of the good and the great and the poor and the lowly. So it depends from where you're standing. You can only tell your story or your narrative, but every story is open for critique. And it's in the critique that we're able to build our knowledge. Because if we accept everything we're given, if I accepted everything I read, I would never have written a book. So it is in questioning what I'm told, that because there's always more questions than answers. So it's not an issue if someone disagrees with what I put forward. But as long as they have the evidence to back up what they're saying, then of course, I mean, I used to think Norton was a great man for being the messenger of the 18, until a brother told me that he was a traitor. And then when I revisited, I realized that he destroyed the power of Kemet, because he refused to take tribute from subordinate states. The temples went into ruins because he said you didn't have to pay tribute anymore. You didn't have to make sacrifice. So the priests and the army overthrew him. So that was another way of seeing it.
He changed the whole hierarchy.
An issue.
So in relation to the Muslim narrative that you put out about who succeeded Muhammad, was Ali, and then he got executed.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
But wasn't Muhammad a black man as well?
No.
Well, he was mixed.
There's narratives that say his head was white and his hair were like his hair were like wool.
Yeah, there's a narrative that says some of it was straight and some of it was curly. Yeah.
Yeah, but what we have to realize is this: it doesn't matter. There has been about 14 people that claim to be the messenger of God or something, including Confucius and Buddha and all these different people. But what you have to understand is most of these narratives are made up because many of the story about Muhammad was written after his death. The story of Jesus was written 70 years after his death.
Yeah, same with the Gospels.
Very smoothly to my third question. Very good. I like the way you did that. So my third question is, there's a guy out there called Shaka Utmost. He's a scholar himself, and he's researched Kemet, and he was talking about the beginnings of the Judaic system, and he said it's down to a person called Dorotheus of Sidon. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, I've heard little bits of it, but I tend to look for the evidence. And there's many things that I do not know. And I am always interested in a new narrative because it's a new way of seeing an old thing. Now, from my understanding, the Hebrews, they were called Ibru.
Ibru, yeah.
They were the follower of the doctrine of Akhenaten, the traitor, the African traitor. So when Moses killed one of Ramesses' soldiers and went on the run, there was no such thing of some Asian religion. This was something new, but Moses supposedly was a priest at the temple of Karnak. So he was knowledgeable enough about the mystery system because he was studying it. So he became the lawgiver of these rebels who went on the run to Sinai. So it took him 40 years to cover a distance of about 40 miles. So this is how Eurasians wrote themselves into African narratives.
Yeah, and he had to wait until the high priest died before he could go back and ask for the people.
Yeah. So you have to look at these, and if you look at the stories in the Bible, apart from reference of the Bible, there's no actual evidence.
And this is why I was saying about Shaka Utmost, is because he said that Dorotheus of Sidon wrote didactic poems. Remember the movement of the stars over like 1,000 years. So he wrote these poems so we can remember how they moved and where they were. And they were translated into 12. The 12
tribe, or the 12 stars, or
and all that.
The equinox.
A whole narrative of Judea from.
Yeah, they was to do with astrology, and Africans were the first astrologers. Moses supposedly knew some of the knowledge. Some Greeks knew some of the knowledge. But if you take it a little bit further, many of these so-called Hebrew forgot their language because their language was Coptic. And they ended up speaking Greek.
Hebrew Greek.
Yeah, they ended up speaking Greek. And Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler of Kemet, was actually a speaker of Coptic.
That's right.
And Coptic was one of the language of the early Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow it got relegated.
Well,
So if you look at the Hebrew influence with the Greeks, you can see where the so-called male god became homoerotica, where it was about man, and women were excluded from the public space.
Yeah, it's very strange because you got the Ankh itself, which means
male and female.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying about the Bible being corrupted, even though, yeah, it's corrupted. It's our thing and it is corrupted. But I mean, if you look in Revelation, it will tell you.
No, but I see, this is what I'm saying. If you have to reference the Bible for anything, then I'm suspicious.
No, I'm just saying. I'm not. I'm just saying. I agree. It's a corrupted.
Yeah.
But
So
I'm still saying. But I also agree that it is part of our thing. Also, it's built off our thing. And in the Revelation, it will still talk about a black man who sits in the throne. So I'm just
no,
putting
what
that
I'm
out
saying
there.
is you have to understand the revelation. If you take, for instance, the negative confession of Annie. Now that was the first judgment drama, which is what Revelation is based on.
Right.
There was an old funerary system in Kemet that dealt with death and the weighing of the soul.
Yeah, that's right.
First recorded
the feather and the scale. Yeah.
Yeah, and everything in the Bible is a drama because in Kemet, religion was a drama. You had rituals. And this is why we need a belief system that will give us our rituals back. We need to develop our own rituals. Even with Rastaman, they used to have them thing called reasoning, which is what we're basically doing now.
That's what we're doing, yes.
Today, you'll find people doing reasoning.
All right, Mark, you had your hand up for a little while. Sorry, brother. Jump in.
Didn't say to forget about me.
No, sir, could never.
I wanted to put another spin on it, right? So, you know, when you joined the army, yeah, it was a sort of time, 1970s, there's a lot of kind of revolutionary talk going on in the black community. Did you get any backlash from the black community, like around Bedford, for joining up? Because surely there couldn't have been that much black men in the British Army at the time.
No, well, you see, from what I gather, right, the way it came about is there was 3 of us used to hang out. And I said to my brethren, I said, Chum, I could go join the army, man. There used to be a recruiting place on Ashburnham Road in Bedford called Drill Hall. They used to have the cadets there and all that. And my friend said, okay, let's go. So when I got to the door, 2 of them turned back. So I went in and I wanted to be a mechanic because I saw it as a way of getting a trade. So I was given a test and this sergeant man said to me, he says, oh, you failed by 1 point, but you can be a driver. So I'm saying nobody failed an exam by 1 point. But anyway, it was saying is that that job wasn't for you. So anyway, I signed up and out of it, I got an HGV. But when I joined, I think a lot of my peers at the time in Bedford, they were either envious or saw me in awe because in those days you could come home in your uniform. And I remember it's like taking the train from Aldershot to Luton Station and then getting or changing bus or train from Luton to Bedford. And when you come home with in your uniform and your peacoat and all that, you look sharp, man. You know what I mean? So you walk down the road and you feel like you could bust iron. So no boy couldn't mess with you. And that's what I liked about it because you see, the army gave me a sense of invincibility because when you're faced with a lot of oppression, you either succumb to it or you face it. And this is what I've done in life, is to face my fear.
So you rose up to meet it, yeah?
Yeah, you face your fear because it's never as bad as you think it is. And I'm
So you
still
never-
here after
So
nearly
so you never
70
really
years.
got a backlash from the community then, no?
Well, the community was still about, they were more into their church because I left the church to join the army because, you know what I mean, man, I talk about you can't have girlfriend and you can't have this, well, deacon I get a man pregnant who is not his wife. You know what I mean? Them things them just see as
Jeez.
hypocrite.
Okay.
You know what I
Fire.
mean?
Fire.
So basically the church didn't have any, when I tell you when a man lick you on one cheek, you must turn the other cheek. No, no, no. I'm coming from where I come from. Man, chop you up if you go on with them thing there. So I ain't having that. You know what I'm saying? So the church wasn't for me.
So
I
was
mean,
it
I
a,
still talk to the pastor still because him still a hang on to the little power. You know
so
what I
was it a
mean?
bad man flex then? Was that what it really was?
No,
Because
it
I
was
was gonna ask the question as well.
no, it's a belief in self. It's a belief. You see, I
Okay.
wasn't born here. So because I wasn't born here, I wasn't subjected to that low self-esteem thing.
Mm.
You know
So
what I mean?
would you say the army is a place for the black man then?
No, not the British Army. It wasn't.
No.
You know what I mean? Because when I came out, I was actually looking to join Mugabe.
Okay.
You know what I mean? But when I found out that Muzarera at the time was in cahoot with the British and wanted the British Army to invade Zimbabwe, I thought no. And then you had there was three leaders. There was Mugabe, Muzarera, and there was another one. Was it Nkomo? But anyway, they were at loggerhead, and Mugabe used to get blamed for a lot of things that he didn't do because he was seen as the threat. Yeah, but I mean, I was quite radical because I felt a little bit let down by the British Army, to be honest.
Right. Can I ask you then? I don't. Have you seen combat and did you kill in combat?
Pardon?
Did you see combat and have you killed in
You
combat?
can't ask the soldier that bit.
No, that's a question.
You can't do
You
that.
shouldn't ask that. You shouldn't
You
ask
can't
that.
ask it?
I'm not Harry.
No.
All right, okay, say nothing.
You know?
You
Say
can't
nothing.
answer.
Say
Put it
nothing.
this way, I got a medal.
All right, say nothing. Say nothing. Anybody else with any more questions? Sorry, I'm rude. I apologize.
Because I was saying about the heretics before, but it's the Vandals I was thinking.
Is that?
The Vandals.
Oh, they're Europeans, aren't they? Yeah. I mean the Visigoths as well, because the Visigoths, they were Germans who invaded Spain. Well, it wasn't called Spain, it was Romania. And when the North Africans went into the Iberian Peninsula, they all fell under the African spell because the Africans brought books, brought pomegranate, brought enough irrigation, and made them clean. And the women loved the Africans, as they always do, because the epitome of a handsome man, he was dark, tall. You know what I'm saying? So it was after the Africans were expelled that they all became Spanish, that the Visigoths and the Romans came to one. That's why you find today in Spain, the northern part, the Basque, don't really want to associate with the South because there's still that racial thing.
So can I ask you, Desmond, did you always knew you had a book in you then?
No, I
Or a
always
few
wanted to
books
write a
in
book, but as I said, because I didn't have a chance to access education, because in the Caribbean, if you can write your name, you're seen as somebody who can read. And then when I came to England, I never got much chance in school. I only had about a year. So I then realized that school is not the end of education. You know what I mean?
So you step forward and educate yourself.
Well, you have to, because nobody's going to do it for you.
True.
And this is why I believe in self first.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do it, how can you inspire anybody else to do anything?
True.
I mean, I hear people come to me and say, oh, I want to do this and do that. I said, well, for example, I had a person I was talking to, he said, oh, I want to help Black men who are gamblers and who have drinking problem. So I said, well, have you ever been a gambler? So he said, no. So I said, how are you going to help people do something you've never done?
Mhm.
I mean, I said, I used to be a gambler, and I can tell you, it's only because I found an alternative, because nature does not accept vacuum. So when you stop doing something, you have to find an alternative.
Sure.
Yeah. So because I like research became my rescue,
See.
because I'd rather be doing my research by myself at home than sitting in a bookie.
Mhm.
I mean,
Okay, Sifu, you have another question?
Yeah, I was trying to continue my last question, which was, well, moving on from the vandal thing, there's a lot of correction to be done. So are you of the opinion that parents today should be using their own, like we used to have one foundation, used to be a teacher foundation in Luton, and I've continued that with real education in my academy. Are you of the opinion we should be using this to correct the history that is being taught?
right. For me, history is about his story.
Right.
I like to think in terms of our story. And this is where I'm saying I'm hoping to be corrected on anything, because my story is not necessarily yours, but there are part of my story which is part of his story. And this is why I included some of his story in our story in my book, because I don't believe that segregation, you can't segregate history or our story, because we've always interacted for good or bad. And so you can't just cut one bit out and talk about one bit, which is what Europeans have done. They have cut us out by destroying evidence, by concealing facts,
Sure.
and have adopted it to please their narrative. So you have the image of Jesus being white. That's Caesar Borgia, a rejected pope. So I wouldn't rely on his story for my story. And I don't think we should allow our children to rely on his story to build their self-esteem.
Sure.
They need our story. So we need our own teachers who have done their research and who have got the evidence to teach them their story, so that they can feel proud about who they are. And
Yeah,
that's what I think.
That's good. I agree with that. Sydney, do you have a question? You had your hands up.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the book, Brother
Rise
Desmond.
up, Brother Sydney.
Yeah, that's a
All power to the ancestors.
Yes, brother. Yes, brother. All power to our ancestors, brother. You know, it's a wonderful, powerful book there. You know, it covers a lot of history that had been neglected by a lot of people throughout the years, and it's a good amalgamation of what I think. You know, I think it's a necessary book for everyone who's trying to find out what happened, all the bits that have been cut out.
Yeah.
My question was, how, you know, starting the book, it must have been quite a journey, you know, to, you know, from getting you know, the first word of the book, you know, like and getting to the end, and you say this is a complete body of work. How was that journey for you?
Well, it started when before I even started uni, I had this idea that we were once a great people, because how could it be that we're where we are now? And while I was studying, I was asking questions, but as I said, I couldn't ask the teacher in my GCSE English class, or my A-level history or sociology class, or my degree class, because they had their own paradigm and topic to cover, and it did not include Africans. And if it did include Africa, it was about Europeans in Africa. So that did not help me. But what it did, it allowed me to ask questions. So for example, I remember writing a poem one day when I learned some things about this so-called Captain Cook, who was supposed to be a great adventurer. So I said, you taught me that Captain Cook was a great adventurer, but I learned that he was a blasted thief. So is when I start learning about certain things, then I start asking more questions and I start reading different books than what was given to me. So when you do a curricular course or a degree course, they have a certain amount of reading material that they give you. And that's because they want to colonize you or socialize you to think a certain way. So that you find that many African people who have been through their university perpetuate this Eurocentric view of African people. I mean, this historian, Olusogun or something, the Nigerian historian, he make reference to, for example, African slaves. No, Africa, there were no slaves in Africa. There were people that were enslaved. There were people that were trafficked. But human beings cannot be slaves. They can be enslaved by other people. So we have to challenge some of these narratives that we told. And to do that, this is one of the reasons I didn't do a PhD, because I know that I would be held within a certain paradigm where I would not be able to put in what I wanted to put in. So it wouldn't be about my story, it would be about his story. And this is why I think Pegasus, which is an English publishing house, didn't accept it, because it was challenging their narrative of their Greek civilization, when the Greek was nothing more than plagiarists. So to come back to your question, it was about accumulation of a certain amount of data, because as I say, I enjoy doing research. So when I'm researching, I tend to reference what I'm researching. And over time, I started to have a conversation with myself. And that conversation got bigger and bigger. And then I started researching certain areas. So I researched the Caribbean, I researched America, always with a focus on the African diaspora. I researched Europe, and always, as I said, I researched the Mediterranean.
How long was the research for? How long did you research for?
No, research for me is continuous. So it's not, I couldn't put a time span on it because it's been many years. And I still have questions that I'm still researching today. And there's people out there that know far more than I do.
No, but I mean, I don't mean research in general, I meant research for the book.
Well, that I should think it was probably a span of about 10 years.
Okay.
From when the first idea, the conception of it, to its completion. And when it was completed, I just had it on the computer, and I thought, it was one day I sat down and I was reading through it, and I thought, yeah, let me send it off to I researched a few publishing house. And so I emailed a copy to, as I said, one English publishers, and copied it to myself so that I have evidence of it. And then I sent a copy to America. And what you find is American publishers, because they have the, was it First Amendment or one of these things about free speech, they're more likely to publish things that they won't publish in England. So,
okay.
So does that address your question, my brother?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
All right, we're about to wrap up now. I've got one more question, I think, from Seafood Blacks, and then we'll wrap up. But I'll stop the recording anyway. Go on, Blacks.
Yeah, I think this would be a nice question to finish on. Since you were in the army, you had to swear an oath to the Queen.
Yeah.
So now the King's in. what happens? Do they have to redo their oath?
No. It's continuous, because you see, it's about to defend the heir and her heir successors. So it's infinitum. And
So
this
that's
is
the
why,
monarchy.
yeah, because you see, this is why I say we live in a monarchical system, because the power of the state is in the monopoly of violence. And the monopoly of violence is controlled by the monarchy. Because the police, the army, the navy, and all that, they have to swear allegiance to the monarchy. Parliament does not have any army.
Mm.
It doesn't have any police force.
Mm.
See, so at the end of the day, power resides with violence.
Did you enjoy your time in the army?
I enjoyed some of it, because it was during my late adolescence and early 20s. And it took me away from the sort of fatalistic outlook on life, because many of my peers, some got involved in violence, some got in robbery, some got killed. And not that I couldn't have been killed, but to me, there was a certain amount of futility of fatalism, that when you're growing up, if you haven't got any outlets or opportunity, it can lead you to become violent and fatalistic.
Mm.
So it gave me a bit of a look at the world, because I did a bit of travel when many of my peers were stuck in the same place, in the same job, day in, day out. I mean, I was experiencing things. I could strip a rifle down blindfolded, put it back together, and so forth.
So instilled a type of order, while at the same time showing you peace in the world.
Yeah, it's like, not like, it wasn't like today where you could go on a quick holiday and all that.
Mm.
So my worldview got enlarged because I was in the army.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw things that I otherwise wouldn't have seen. And I understood things that I otherwise wouldn't have understood.
Mm-hmm.
And it also gave me a sense of discipline. You see, because a lot of people like to start things, but they don't have the staying power. They give up easily.
Mm.
I mean, they blow in the wind like leaves. Where in the army, instill in you a sense of discipline, a sense of self-worth. You tend to have a good sense of presentation. I mean, I see many young people, when they walk in the street, they cover their head and they're hanging down. No, I was taught to walk with my head up.
Mm.
Feel proud of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys for popping by, and thanks again, Desmond, for popping in.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for sharing this time. And
yeah, man, letting us know the history and what is and what is not.
And I've got some copies of the book if anyone wants some. Got some paperbacks.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think I want one of them still.
Yeah, just drop a message in the WhatsApp group.
All right, cool.
All right.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in that. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Desmond.
All right, Curtis, can I ask you quickly? Did you get my message?
I did, brother, but I don't know. I don't know if it's my phone or yours. I was trying to send a reply to you.
Okay,
but
I'll check you out another time.
But it didn't let me send it, so I'm not sure what's happened.
No, I'll check with you again then. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No problem.
All right.
Nice.
All right. Blessings again, my brother.
Yeah, man. Rise up, everyone.
Thank you.